Allen Hewitt. Welcome to the Neuroarchitect.
Thank you for having me.
Please tell us more about your career path and the motivations behind your focus on design cognition, classical architecture and preservation, and sustainable design.
Well, sure, that's a lot to talk about, but I started my career as an architect in Philadelphia. I had studied at Yale with Vincent Scully and in Philadelphia with Robert Venturi and Steve Eisenhower, Denise Scott Brown. And I worked first for Venturi and Rauch during the 1970s. And I began doing some writing as the editor of the University of Pennsylvania's architectural journal called VIA, and always loved architectural history, always loved historic preservation. And I also, at Penn, got interested in the work of James Gibson through a professor, John Lang, who taught a course on designing for human behavior. So that's always been an interest of mine. And in fact, I then wrote a thesis at Penn. I think the first thesis to do this using James Gibson's ideas about affordances and occlusion in talking about architectural ornament. So that thesis was never published, but I kept my eye on those issues as I began practicing. I then taught at Rice University in Houston for a few years, then went to Columbia University, and finally finished my career at New Jersey Institute of Technology. And my interests continued in architectural history, but I also got more and more interested in behavioral aspects of architecture, and also on the what I called embodied cognition for design. And eventually I wrote a couple of articles on that. And in 2020, I published my first book using neuroarchitecture on the history of architectural design, or what I call a cognitive history of architectural design. So that's a brief introduction.
So, in simple words for the audience, what's design cognition?
Well, design cognition is how architects or anyone who creates an artifact thinks about how to do that. And so instead of just looking at it from an architectural point of view as how someone draws, I try to look at things from a broader perspective in terms of what I call modes of conception. If one is trying to conceptualize any artifact, and a building is a very complicated artifact, humans need to apply their imagination to do that. But they also need, because a building is very complicated, they have to have steps. Sometimes there's a sort of heuristic or rules of thumb. How are they going to go about that? And it turns out that when we look at it historically, humans have thought about architecture, thought about building in a lot of different ways. And prior to the Renaissance, humans didn't, in general, think about architecture in terms of its representation outside of the craft of building it. It's only really in the 1420s, after perspective is introduced, after paper is introduced, that humans began to look at architecture as a design on a representational basis, as in, let's say, a model or a drawing. Even though drawings and models were used prior to the Renaissance, up until that point, most design thinking was about crafting the object, that is, actually doing the building of the object, rather than representing the object prior to doing the building.
Okay, so you were also talking about ornaments. What about this research? What did you find?
Well, I found that if you use the human sciences, and I've been trying to publish a paper since 2020, which is still in press with a journal that got kind of messed up. But I have a thing called the teleology of architectural ornament. What is ornament for, and how do we use the human sciences to tell us why ornament is necessary in buildings? And the reason it's necessary, in a few words, has to do with our vision and the things and what James Gibson called occlusion. What is in front of something else? So anytime we're trying to perceive a surface like a wall, a window, a door, or even floors, even the building heights in a city, the way in which we tell what's in front of what is by the occluding surface. And what ornament often does is it reinforces the edges of occluding surfaces. So most ornament is on cornices, on the edges of buildings, on the side of buildings, around the frames of windows, around the frames of doors, and occasionally, of course, if it's a freestanding element, perhaps ornament is on an obelisk, or ornament is on something that is trying to get your attention. And so attention is very important in terms of how we negotiate the environment, how we do wayfinding. And it's if one looks historically at ornament, it's almost always, if it's not decoration, which is surface, it's almost always at the edge of an architectural surface. And it's prior to 1920, every architecture, Chinese architecture, Mayan architecture, Indian architecture, classical architecture, all architecture uses architectural ornament. It's only after the modern movement that we stopped doing that.
If you want to compare with, because you focused also on classical architecture, if you want to compare with the classical architecture with today's architecture, if you want to take a specific environment, you want to compare the old with the new, what do you see? How does it impact humans?
Well, I also have a paper that I wrote for a conference on health and classical architecture at Cambridge a few years ago, called "The Body Breathes Emotion: Affective Ornament," essentially in classical sites. That is, how do classical buildings, and in this case Greek archaic and classical, the two terms are actually quite precise. That would be, from the 7th down to the 4th century in ancient Greece, you have these two kinds of temples. And it turns out that the Greeks understood emotion in terms of breathing, in terms of, shortness of breath, and they knew about PTSD, and they actually, in their columns and in their temples, were telegraphing very specific aspects of the emotion of battle, the emotion of sacrifice in these temples. And of course, columns are all about the human figure. In a column, you have the head, which is the capital. You have the base, which is the foot. You have various allusions to things like animal bones. And so classical ornament, and indeed the whole classical language of architecture, was very precisely indexed to states of emotion and the body. And this hasn't been pointed out much in the previous literature. I don't know of any author that's used neuroscience to do this, although my mentor as an architectural historian, Vincent Scully, in his book, The Earth, the Temple, and the Gods, talked about this a lot. But that book was essentially thrown out by archaeologists as being not properly, let's say, scientific or archaeological when it was published, but it surely is one of the best books on emotion in Greek temples.
I've been doing research about the old civilizations, the ancient civilizations, let's say, and if their spaces uh, were made in a way to alleviate symptoms of PTSD or whatever, mental conditions. And here you're saying that you found that they reflected the emotions. But do you see also that they might have been done in a way to alleviate these mental conditions, such as PTSD and
Well,
this
well,
stuff?
I would say yes. I mean, for one thing, of course, when you talk about biophilic ornament and things that help, buildings that help us understand nature and our relationship to the natural world. Classical buildings, and that includes any classical buildings, but particularly Greek classical buildings, are always pointing us in the direction of a proper relationship between ourselves and nature in a way that helps us understand why nature is so soothing, why nature makes us feel so much more human. Of course, we're animals, and it helps us relate to our animal nature. And in any classical site, I mean, of course, Doxiadis told us that classical sites orient us towards mountains, as did Scully. They orient us towards natural features of the environment. Delphi, of course, has that amazing valley site. Corinth has that site that goes across the water. And by the way, I've never visited Greece, but I know these sites fairly well from academic study. I'd like to go to Greece, but in any case, these sites are going to uh, um, sort of balance us emotionally by putting us in a sort of a natural relationship between our animal selves and the environment around us. And even though perhaps the some of the ornament in the buildings would be reminiscent of something that happens in battle, that still can help people emotionally deal with things like violence in battles. The Greeks, of course, were constantly at war. Ancient Greek war happened every 40 years, basically, right? So it was a fact of their lives, and if they're going up to the Temenos, they're in a polis, and their polis has fought a war against another polis. If they walk up into the Temenos and they feel that battle was justified, that in fact they were those that died, maybe their sons, died not in vain, but for the purpose of defending the polis, that in fact helps them understand
Mm.
how those emotions are in their bodies, right? I mean, that's only natural. So I'd say keep up your research on these ancient sites, because there's all sorts of great things one can learn about emotion, especially about the emotional nature of architecture and landscape, if one researches those. And that includes like things like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. I know you had done some work in Turkey. Um, uh, Ephesus, any of the Turkish sites, Aphrodisias, all of those sites contain so much that we can learn about architecture.
Since you mentioned that you didn't visit the site, but you're talking about it, have you ever visited an ancient site? Like you engaged all your senses in it? And if you did, like, what were your feelings? What did you find?
Well, at Paestum, in Italy, I spent a lot of time in Italy, and one of the most important architect experiences in my entire life, I would say, was was approaching the temples at Paestum, the three large temples that are among the best preserved Greek temples in the world. As you may know, both Sicily and Italy have fantastically well preserved sites. And I remember at first, from far away, this is in the early 1980s, so there weren't a lot of tourists there at that point. And my wife and I were walking toward these temples, and at first you see them as, these quite large objects as you're walking toward them. But then as I walked toward one of the temples, um, I remember that my body, well, first of all, I became very, not agitated, but emotional as I walked toward these columns. And I remember thinking, well, I'm so small, and these are things are so large and so powerful. Why am I feeling these emotions as I walked toward these columns? And I thought to myself, well, I'm empathizing with them as a human, a small human against a very large but very human looking object, right? Of course, the Greeks thought of them as bodies, or as hoplites, the hoplites, of course, hoplites uh, is essentially the word for soldier in Greek. So marching up to those and feeling that there were kind of these soldiers standing in front of me was one of the most powerful and awe-inspiring emotions I have ever experienced in my life. And it's one of the reasons I still write about classical buildings, because for me, that was, and I have not been to a Mayan site or to an Indian temple. I'm sure that similar things would happen if I went to one of those monuments, but the Greek buildings were for me fantastically powerful. Of course, Roman buildings to some extent, although Roman buildings are more urban. Um, I simply found that to be extraordinary in every possible way.
Yes, it's true. I've worked on this as a researcher, but also I've taught history of architecture. And what I can see is that, since humans always wanted to, and until now, we want to keep our imprint, and that this is through what we can see the most, which is architecture and the built environment. So the Romans were more about showing their power, and the Greeks were more like showing power, but also knowledge, the power of knowledge. It's not only the power of war. Because when you look at the columns, when you look at the temples, there's this femininity, there is this, they're trying to show the wisdom of arts, of, the handwork, more than just like the war mentality, the war work.
Well, yes, I also one of the parts of my research that I'm quite involved in today, because I also work on the restoration of buildings, especially classical buildings here in the U.S. And I write about classical architecture in the U.S. But when you talk about the knowledge in craft, and you have techne in Greek, and you have a poesis in Greek, some of these Aristotelian terms about the making of things with hands. In Greek philosophy, of course, um, techne, art, and the craft of making are very much bound together. They didn't have what were called fine arts. Poetry and carving stone were the same kind of art for Greeks, as there wasn't a distinction between, let's say, painting and the making of a Greek crater or vase, right? The people who painted those and made them were poets or artists. The people who, of course, carved those columns and that ornament were artists. And the craft, techne is also sort of craft. The way that those things were made and the embodied way that they were made um, telegraphed empathy between the maker and the observer, as we now know. And when we talk about embodied cognition, one of the great examples of that is the crafting of things like architectural ornament, or the carving of stone, or the making of a beautiful vase. All of those things for the Greeks were fundamental aspects of their epistemology and their idea of knowledge being for the good of everyone, right? For the good of the polis, right? So that's super important. And it's another way in which I think neuroscience helps us to understand those ancient civilizations and how closely they allied themselves with art, let's say.
One of the interesting things that I've seen throughout my experience is when I met different communities and different people, from different backgrounds. And I saw that they measure time in a different way. So, for example, what is for Greeks like quite new is for Americans like kind of old, because they told me we are a new civilization, so we cannot really measure what you were talking about. I was talking about definitions. And want to understand like what's for the Americans classical, what is to be preserved in the US, for example.
Well, we're a young country. And I just also did an essay about Thomas Jefferson and ancient Greece. He read Greek, by the way, and he thought of America as a new Greece, as as the Germans did for a little while when they were building their nation state. But particularly in America, as a very young country, our lack of maturity in a way has always bothered us. It still does, but actually, there's a kind of, it's a little bit of an inferiority complex in relationship to the old civilizations of Europe. So when the founding fathers in this country were looking for architecture that would reach back in time and give us a sense of who we are in relation to antiquity in a way, they turned to classical buildings. And so we have a wonderful classical tradition that I write about, but it's a young classical tradition, and it starts with Jefferson and a man named Benjamin Henry Latrobe. And it goes all the way to a wonderful architect named Alan Greenberg, who's a classical architect that works today in the United States, one of my mentors. And I've done classical buildings. So our sense of time is, yes, rather immature. We don't see the world. Unfortunately, we see the world as future oriented people, and that's, I think, a problem with our technocracy. Whereas I think in Europe, and I was just there for about a month, there's more of a sense of we are in a longer continuum in Europe, just as you might say a Mayan, a native Mayan in Mexico would see herself as going back, centuries, maybe thousands of years, whereas a Hispanic Mexican wouldn't necessarily have that same feeling if that helps you.
Mm. What kind of buildings do you aim to preserve in the US? Like, let's say I want to visit, I visited, but let's say I want to visit now, and you want to show me something that you are keeping, like to say this is part of our identity as architecture. What should I say?
Well, we would say both ancient America, and of course that would be Mayan temples as American buildings. They're not North American, but in North America we have the old pueblos, or the ancient sites in the Southwest are very important for someone to look at, because it shows that, in fact, people were living here. Now, those are, most of the Native American buildings like teepees and so on were ephemeral, so you can't see them now. They moved around, but in those civilizations, Arizona, New Mexico, are very important to see, to understand the antiquity of our nation and the ruggedness, the way in which these people lived in very rugged conditions, but still produced beautiful architecture and artifacts. But then you also, of course, need to go to Williamsburg. You need to go to Boston. You need to go to Philadelphia. You need to go to St. Augustine, Florida, or to some of the early towns in California, the missions of Junipero Serra in California. So you want to see that colonial heritage to understand how the European powers, the colonial powers, influenced us in positive and negative ways.
Mm. In your research, what methodology do you use? Have you ever worked on interviewing participants or observing or using questionnaires? Like, did you have any contact with people to see how they think? Or was it like based on past literature?
Most of my research has been on past literature, although I am trying and have interacted with a couple of neuroscientist friends. One is named Vinod Goel. He's a neuroscientist in Toronto. Another, Stefan Schneider, who's a neuroscientist in Vienna. And Stefan and I are working on an experiment in which we're going to try to do films and interviews with people drawing, artists and architects drawing, to understand more about how drawing is a form of thinking. That's an experiment I'd like to do. I'm also working with a colleague named John Massigal, who writes about the design of streets. And we're proposing an experiment in which we would use interviews, but also headsets for people walking through urban environments, specifically great street environments like a London terraced street, or one could do it in a Greek village on a Greek island. I mean, any of these kinds of environments would be ideal to test various kinds of perceptual and emotional responses to architecture and to beautiful places as well. The idea of testing beauty, I think, is now coming to be a very, very important aspect of our work if we're doing neuroscience. What is beauty and how do we test for it?
How do you measure beauty?
Well, I just gave a lecture in Italy about this. I called it the four pillars of beauty in architecture and landscape. And the four things that I think are most essential in terms of understanding beauty are: first, any beautiful object draws our attention immediately. And of course, in the brain, attention is absolutely essential to sort of appreciate the quality of anything. It needs to get our attention, and it needs to get us out of the default network and into the attentive state. So that's the first thing. Any beautiful object draws attention. Secondly, it offers us a multi-sensory delight. It delights our more than one sense. Okay, so a beautiful object will delight our sense of smell and our sense of hearing and our sense of sight, but not always in the same way, of course. Thirdly, the beautiful object is going to be give us a sort of part-whole relationship that is truly harmonious. And I use the word congenitas. Nothing can be added or taken away from a beautiful object without affecting it. Okay, if you add it or take it away, that object may be less beautiful if you do that. And lastly, I think all beautiful artifacts have a spiritual dimension. And I don't mean that you have to be religious to understand the spirituality. I mean that the spirit of that object comes through in intangible ways when you experience it in your senses. So those are the four pillars of beauty. And I think if you want to define beauty, the last thing is that beauty affects everyone in the same way. Beauty is not always in the eye of the beholder. It is certainly culturally biased and certainly can affect us that way, preference and taste. But a beautiful object will be beautiful to everyone. That's my opinion.
Beside the research work, have you implemented this kind of thinking, let's say, in projects?
I try to do that. I do, as I say, I do a lot of historic preservation and a lot of additions to historic buildings, churches, houses, farms. In fact, when I worked in New Jersey, I did a lot of work in agricultural environments, the beautiful, beautiful farmland, farmsteads, barns, houses, etc. And so my design work or my preservation work, I try always to incorporate these things. I interview people. I ask them about what is special about the place in which they live, particularly. What is special about the place that they inhabit, and why is that special? And then those interviews, I'll try to get some sense of how these people react emotionally to these places and try to reinforce some of the aspects of those places that are meaningful to them. And that would mean, let's say, saving certain aspects of a house that people love, and making sure that they are well restored. On the other hand, any kind of addition that I make to a historic building, I usually make it in the style of the original building. I don't try to make a modern addition, because for me, continuity in the history of a building is far more important than showing what time it was built.
And what does it mean to you to do hand drawing instead of using software?
Well, it means a lot. I'll show you. I'll show you, one of my sketches from a European trip. But when I travel, I sketch everything. I do everything by hand sketches. So, and I make these to me these are memories of where I've been, right? And if I draw anything by hand, that's including a design drawing or a travel drawing, it locks in the embodied experience of designing something. And to me, that's everything. So I will not design on a computer. And in my book, I interviewed a very important man in the Pixar art department, Pixar being the movie studio that did Toy Story and Ratatouille and so on. And he basically said, at Pixar, we do no creative work in storytelling on a computer. Everything we do is through hand drawing and modeling. And that, for me, touched me deeply. This is back in 2006. I learned this. And I basically said, well, if the Pixar Studios people don't trust computers, I'm certainly not going to trust a computer to do my design. I certainly don't want AI doing it. So even though I draw on a computer because I have to as an architect, as architects, we have to use them. I simply use it as a tool, as a drafting machine, just as I would have used a T-square. But I'm not going to use anything but a hand model or a hand drawing in the things I design. I won't do it.
When I was an architecture student, I was focusing also more on my hand drawing, and I was telling them that you feel the project, you feel like the colors on your hands. And when you're drawing it, it's like you're creating it like with your hands. You feel yourself with the project, in the project. You understand like what I mean? It's like your feelings and your emotions and everything is like becoming like kind of a unity with this project. You're feeling it much more than when it's on a screen. On a screen, it's just maybe some gratification, some eye gratification, like everything we see in a picture, but it's not like you feel yourself in it, like with all your senses. And it gives it some kind of different taste, and you get even more attached to it as a project.
Absolutely. All my students have always said that to me too. I think, you obviously get it, and now neuroscience as well. So you understand why that might be the case, and the embodied experience of something, the more you are using your body to do something, the more invested you will be in whatever it happens to be. If you're dancing, you can't dance. You can watch people dancing, and your mirror neurons will be locked in. But in order to feel like you're dancing, you have to dance. In order to be a musician, you need to feel the rhythm in your body, right? So the same thing with architecture. You can, of course, you understand when you learn to draw a plan, an architecture student, it usually takes about a year to a year and a half, in my experience, to teach a student to be able to walk through her plan, right? You can walk through your plan and experience the space at a certain point as an architect. That just becomes second nature to you. But if you haven't drawn enough, you can't ever have that sense of walking through your plan, right? And so I would ask students, do you understand how big that space is? Are you walking through it? Do you understand how far away the wall is? And if it's a beginning student, they'll say no, right? They can't, because they can't, right? But you're an experienced architect. You can walk through any plan, right? Because you've gotten this fully kind of embodied training in how to make architecture. And for that reason, I think we've got to keep students drawing. Otherwise, they're just not going to have that experience, right?
This is also what I saw with my students when I was teaching technical graphics, by hand. And they learned the sense of dimensions through drawing by hand, the doors, the facades, to do the scales. They were able to see it, like not only to see it like behind the screen, to manipulate, let's say. They were doing it with their own hands. And it changed their perspective. And this is very important in terms of, let's say, we're talking about the neuroarchitect using neuroscience and architecture, also for the architect, not only for the user, to use their senses in doing a space, to be on site, to check the site, like, and the surroundings, and then to do some drawings by hand before doing the project. It's also as important.
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree. And I say that students need, first of all, to travel to a project site. If you're giving them a project, it's always a good idea to have it in a real place, not do these abstract things where there isn't a place they can visit. So then by visiting the place, by sketching it, and then as they try to place their building there, they can get a sort of locked in experience of why one thing will work on that site and wouldn't work on another site. It only works on that site. And also giving them the sense that that they can, in a way, take their experience back to the studio and have it in their brain, in their body, as they're doing the drawings, as they're doing the design. That to me is absolutely essential. And I also think they should see historic sites. I think that students, of course, you carry around in your memory. If you've been to, I haven't been to Corinth, but I'm sure that anybody who goes to Corinth carries Corinth, the site, around in their memory because it's one of the most powerful places on earth. You can never kind of unlearn going to a great place like Independence Hall in Philadelphia for us, or the Grand Canyon, or any of these places. They imprint something on your memory. And so I think you should see as many beautiful places as you can in your life as an architect.
This is what I would call also the engagement experience in terms of architecture. Any final thoughts or message you would like to deliver?
I first of all, I thank you. I'm very happy we could talk about Greece. I'm hoping I can get there sometime soon. Being able to speak with you about architecture has been a great joy. And the I guess another final thought would be, for all students, visit great historic sites, draw them in a sketchbook. To me, that's a message that I want every architecture student, and indeed probably every architect, to understand that this will stock your memory with the things that you need to make beautiful places.
Mark, thank you so much for this interesting conversation.
You are very welcome.
And thanks for watching us.